Welcome to the OverAnalyzers. I'm Dan. He's Mike. I'm drinking a gin and tonic. He's drinking.
Breakside Stay West IPA.
Yeah. All right. Ready?
Yep. Cheers.
Cheers.
That is probably my favorite IPA ever. I highly recommend it.
All right.
So you have been here. Let me tell this little story. That'll get us into what we want to talk about. Back in school, when I was in music school, I remember this guy who was a guitar player, same as me. And he was one of the more extreme characters that I knew from school. And he had this philosophy where he wanted to be a fantastic guitar player. And that's all he really cared about. So he did not work. He didn't have that big of a class load. He lived right next to campus. He wore the same clothes every day. And not literally the same clothes, but like black shirt, all his wardrobe is identical. And his philosophy was, I want to practice playing guitar every single second of the day as much as possible. Zero social life, zero anything. So he was in school, so he had classes to do, but pretty much the ideal scenario in terms of how much time you're able to spend on, in this case, guitar playing. And I remember he had this almost brute force philosophy. He was the type where, he set himself a schedule and he said, I'm, 2 hours a day, I'm going to play scales, just 2 hours on and on. And then 2 hours, I'm going to practice my repertoire piece. And then for an hour, I'm going to do this and that. And like all these drills and hardcore practice. And I remember talking with the professor just about him and about that philosophy. And even at the time, without having too many solid ideas about how you should spend your time and all the things that we've talked about, even at the time, I remember thinking, man, that can't be that effective, right? To sit there and practice scales for 2 hours every day. Like, is that really the best way to use your time? And the guitar professor was like, yeah, I think you're right. He probably isn't really, doing the best things he could. But if you're that dedicated, if you're practicing for 10 hours a day, then you're going to get good no matter what, right? If you're that obsessed with it, it doesn't really matter that much. And I remember thinking, okay, that's true, but at the same time, that's really stupid. Because if you're playing for 10 hours a day and 2 of those hours are really beneficial, imagine if 4 hours were really beneficial. You'd be twice as good. Or if you could get 6 hours to be really worthwhile, then you're 3 times as good. Like, it doesn't matter how much time you have. If you don't spend it efficiently, you're leaving a ton of possible improvement off the table, or leaving it on the table, whatever the expression is. So anyway, it made me think about this question that we want to talk about today. How do you not waste your time when you're working on something? And it doesn't matter how much time you have, whether you've got 10 minutes a day or 10 hours a day, you need to spend it efficiently. Like, we're all limited on time. Doesn't matter if you're like this guy or you have no job and you get to spend 10 hours a day working on something. You should spend it efficiently.
Right. And I kind of wanted to like do a disclaimer of like, just because you're relaxing or doing something other than whatever skill you're trying to improve, it doesn't mean that you're wasting time. Like, doing other things is not a waste. I just wanted to make sure that we kind of like try and define what wasted time actually means, or like what we're talking about. And I think it's mostly to do with, once you begin working on the thing, how do you make sure you're being most effective?
Well,
I think
in one sense, if you're trying to work on something, accomplish some goal you have, then the more efficient you are with that, the more, if you're spending 3 hours when you could only be spending 1, that's 2 hours that you could spend relaxing or socializing or enjoying your time with family or whatever. So no matter how you slice it, using time well is extremely important. Like, no matter how you think about it.
so. I can say that I'm kind of like that guy, or I have been a lot like that guy over the last few years, where it's just like any second I can, I will just work on learning stuff, and I will draw and draw and draw, and I just
Right.
brute force, I think is what you said, but that's kind of how you could describe me. I will torture myself endlessly to try and reach some unattainable goal. At least that's kind of how I've been over the last few years.
Same.
And recently I've looked back through my sketchbooks and I've realized that I have solved problems already that I work on now. Like I've already answered questions that I'm still asking like over and over again. So I've already
You mean
learned things.
you
And then
thought about something and found the answer to it and then forgot it? Is that what you're saying?
I thought about something, had a question, worked for months or even years on something, and then completely forgot it and did it all over again, like multiple times.
Yeah.
It's not even an exaggeration. And so it's really actually very sad and kind of depressing. And if I had just found a way to remember all of these things, even if I worked a lot slower and more relaxed, like I would be way more ahead than what I am now. So
Yeah, there's through the past several months, one of the things that has really worked its way into my brain at a very deep level is this idea that if you learn something and then you forget it, it's pointless. You didn't do anything. And I don't know how far we want to get into this today, but that has started to become a way for me to think about almost everything, even just stuff that happens in my life. I someday I go through the day and think I'm gonna forget this day. So did it matter what I did or didn't do? It starts to
right,
get very philosophical and almost existential, I guess. But
right.
it without getting too far into my changing life philosophy, at the very least, in terms of learning, that's an absolute fundamental baseline truth in that if you learn something and forget it, you might as well have not done that.
Yeah. So, well, I do want to get into that, but to try and organize this a little better,
Yeah.
I made a list of what I think are some of the ways that you can waste time or lose time. So I want to see if you agree with them or
Okay.
have thoughts on them.
Let's do it.
That one's uh, number 3. But number 1, I named purgatory. And this is the number 1 for me and what I've realized has been the biggest time waster since the beginning. And that is, and this happens on a lot of different levels, but wondering what to do, wondering what is right and what is wrong. And this happens on a macro, like life
Yeah.
level, and also like little micro decisions of, should I make a line here or a line there? Or do I put something over here or a little bit to the left?
Yeah.
Which one's right? I don't know. And well, I have found that for me, wondering what to do is the absolute biggest time waster for me. And I guess in theory, if you always knew what to do, then you could just do it. It's not quite that simple, but
Well, so I have my own thoughts on this,
okay.
and probably from a slightly different angle than you, because in my case, the thing I've been working on is a real-time strategy game where wondering what to do, in my case, usually happens during a game. And because it's a real-time game, it is, at least in one sense, it's a race where you're trying to execute something faster than your opponent. So any moment, even a second or two of wondering, oh, what should I do now, is terrible. So
Is death. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, in the sense of the game, yes, it is death. So I've had to aggressively try and kill any moment of wonder. Like the wondering has to happen outside the game, not in the game. But I don't think that's quite what you're doing because you aren't
No,
quite as
I
time
think
restrained.
it's no, I when you think of people doing art, you probably think of, oh, you just sit down and feel things and then draw things and, beautiful things happen. It's not like that at all. As an illustrator, you are giving a very tight deadline. You have to design something on the spot, get it done, get it out, send it in, no matter if you're happy with it or not, doesn't matter. There's tons of pressure from investors and all these different companies, and tons of money is being thrown around, and it's all up to you to make it look really good really fast. And so you have to work very quickly under a lot of pressure all the time if you're working in an industry like I am. And it's not at all like Bob Ross happy trees. It's nothing like that. Uh, I mean, there's different types of art, and
Yeah.
there's certainly enjoyable parts of it. But let me tell you how it shows up for me, the wondering
Yeah.
what to do. I was given just recently. Or we started a new project, and for that week, I think it was really just the last 3 days of the week. It was come up with a concept, design this whole world based on this story. Trying to be careful not to say anything. Uh,
We'll bleep out any specific
right.
details.
So come up with concepts based on this super rough story and turn it in on Friday evening. So I have like 3 days to do this. It's in a totally different style than what I've worked in recently. So I haven't done this type of style in a very long time. I have no real method for it or process for it. And I'm wondering uh, over everything. I'm wondering, do I use these types of brushes or these types of brushes? How do I pick a color palette for this type of thing? What should it look like? What is the story suggesting? Where do I look for where do I look for when I'm researching this? Like, what is the right answer? I have to design this whole thing, and other artists are also designing this thing, and it's like it's so nebulous, and you're not really sure, and so you're wondering how to do everything. I was wondering on the design aspect, but also the technical aspect, and I didn't really have a clear process. So, do I jump right into the painting? Do I do more sketches? Do I do more thumbnails? Do I wait on this? I have no real idea of how long it's going to take me, and yet it's due on Friday. And so, at every step of the way, I'm questioning what is right, what is wrong. I don't know because I don't have a good idea of what it looks like when it's done right. And so I turn it in on Friday and it's a complete mess and I absolutely hate it and it's terrible. And mostly because I kept starting and then having to rewind and do things over
Right.
again and then starting and then rewinding. And it ends up being a complete mess. And so the amount of work, like if you took out all the second guessing stuff and
Mhm.
just strung together all of the work that I did, it could be condensed down probably into a single day worth of work, maybe even half a day. But because of all that second guessing, I'm
Right.
wasting this enormous amount of time. And wondering what's right or wrong is very different than problem solving. Like when you're solving a problem, you have to wonder what the best course of action is to take. Uh, but that's like an action item. Like that that's something you have to do. I don't know if I'll explain this right,
To
but
me, the way I have been thinking of it is that I've been calling it hesitation, where you don't know what the right course of action is, and so you do nothing, or you sit there and kind of consider your options,
yeah,
and it's like you said purgatory. I've thought of it like treading water, but it's as if you aren't moving forward anywhere. You're kind of
right.
looking around, being a little bit like a deer in headlights type of thing.
Yeah, and every time I make one decision, I'm questioning, well, maybe I should have gone the other
Right.
way, and I bounce back and forth. And so that ended up a complete mess. On the flip side, we did another piece the next week on the same project. Now I have the chance to do the same thing again. And this kind of goes into a couple other numbers, but I reviewed everything I did for that one, came up with a process based on what I thought I should have done, and and this is very similar to what we talked about last week with the categories. So I started a category thing for this, and I wrote down tips on or reminders like don't do this, don't do this, don't get stuck in this phase. After you do this, this comes next. So after thumbnails, don't get bogged down with the design of unimportant elements. Focus on the main focal point, and then when you scan in your page, make sure it's this size or whatever. Like all these little tips and tricks of what I just learned from my last round. And with this second round, I'm burning through it. Within one day, I did as much as I did in 3 days for the last one, and it looks so good. I mean, for what I want it to be, it
Yeah.
is right on track, and it feels so good uh, to be sure of yourself. And I could only do that by reviewing what I did before. But I eliminated all of that wondering of what to do because I was able to come up with a clear process, and all of that wasted time was just taken away.
Right.
Um, so that's kind of how it shows up for me in my work.
Um, I've heard you talk about this a little bit before. Can you explain or show or describe, like, what does that actually look like for you? I mean, you've developed this system. I mean, is it a bunch of steps? Is it a flow chart?
Well, hold on. I'm trying to find it. I have a categories of art. Or I'm a little afraid to show it because I might have secret stuff on it. But
We'll censor it.
it's a Word document,
Okay.
right? And I have what I do at work is called key art. So I have categories of key art. And the titles are, a couple of them is 3D model underlay. So when I'm given a 3D model underlay, I have a couple steps to go through. Choose whether to incorporate model or cover up. Err on covering up the model. And a couple other notes. If something is needed from the model, cut it out, treat it as a separate object. This probably won't make sense to you, but here's my notes.
I
Map
want to
out
hear it.
perspective. Okay. And then I map out the perspective. Next stage is get a single lighting reference. Next stage is do thumbnails. Choose a thumbnail. When I switch to painting, I paint the sky and the ground first. After that, in Photoshop, I create folders for the large sections and then keeps going. And then I have other categories like a photograph underlay. And then this one is from a black and white painted thumbnail, digital version. And then I have like a traditional version. And then I have, I have a bunch of different ones just like that. And so the one I just did, actually can't tell you the title. But anyway, it just goes through and gives me tips. And it's like, don't get caught up in wasting time doing like minuscule things that don't matter. Focus on this thing, keep this thing at the top of your head when you're working on this part. And then don't move on until you're happy with the last 10 things. And then you move on. So it's a roadmap for me.
Yeah.
And at any point in the process, once I've kind of developed this document, I know exactly where I'm at. And so I know if I'm succeeding or if I'm failing because I know the phase that I'm in. A while ago, you had talked about, I forget what you said, but it was like someone was asking about treating like a whole thing as a win or a lose. I guess like if you took a whole Starcraft game, like if you win or you lose, like that is one way to look at it. Like if you won the game, then you did great. If you lost the game, you sucked. And that's actually a really bad way to look at it because you want to treat it like all of these different little phases, and if you won each one. So a single StarCraft game might be split into 20 different phases, and maybe you won 18 of them and lost two of them.
I think we were talking about heuristics, and that's the conversation around that. And just quick side note, because of some of the comments on that, I realized that heuristics is not actually that common of a term, so we could maybe quickly define that. Heuristics is essentially a simplistic way of evaluating something. It's essentially a model for assigning value or evaluating something. So for example, in chess, the only thing that matters is checkmating, right? Like you're trying to win the game. In that sense, win-loss is all that matters. But the game is really complicated. It takes a long time. There's lots of tiny things that happen, and you need a way of evaluating, is this a good move, is this a bad move? So we assign number values to the pieces. A pawn is 1, knight is 3, rook is 5, queen is 8, I think. Uh,
Sure.
it's something like that. But we assign these very simple point systems, and it gives you a way of thinking, oh, is it good to trade a rook for a knight? And like, yeah, it is because this is worth 5 and that worth 3. Like it's a simple way of evaluating that. And I could not possibly agree more. One of the most it's taken me a while to get to this point, but I in any given StarCraft game, the game might last for 15 minutes. I cannot just rely on win loss. I have worked very hard to begin developing this sense of, oh, at 1 minute and 27 seconds, I didn't start the Overlord for. It was supposed to start at 127. I started at 129. That's a tiny mistake. It's 2 seconds late, and that's unlikely to affect the outcome of the game, but it's a mistake. And so I've tried to develop simple heuristics, benchmarks, timings, everything to try and apply at any single moment of the game. And it is very difficult because I might play a game and do really well for the first 6 minutes and then lose because I haven't
Right.
finished ironing out those last things. But anyway, I think that's super, super key.
Well,
And
that is exactly what I'm doing.
yeah,
It's the same thing. And I I think it's also kind of important is that having a roadmap like this or having like a list of an order that you must go in for something like art or music or something that's supposed to be free form and creative all the time.
yeah,
Like it might sound like trying to apply science to something that should be sort of magical. But to me, the science you add the science so you know where to add the magic. You know where to to tense and focus and do all the math, and then you know when to relax and do the creative free
yeah.
thinking stuff. And so it's a roadmap of, I don't know, when to focus and when to relax and when to do those things. It's not like taking all the fun out of it.
Yeah. Just you kind of hit on a pet peeve. I despise the romanticization of music and art and actually almost everything. I mean, people do it with science. They talk about really early on we talked about geniuses and how we just worship them and we just act like they're these magical beings that the earth was blessed with. uh you know, Einstein and Tesla and all these people, and we have absurd fantasies about them. If you want to be effective at anything, yes, absolutely, thinking outside the box and being creative are fundamentally important. But nobody composes a great piece of music by just sitting down and feeling the universe channeled through them. That's a silly fairy tale. They understand their craft extremely well. And not to get into a debate about music theory or not, it doesn't matter what system they use for thinking about music or art. They have some way of understanding what is what. They know how to put things together, and they have some process, whether they've written it out explicitly or they've just developed it intuitively, but they have some way of being extremely effective and being able to apply themselves to whatever they're working on to create some great thing. I I dislike the whole division of art and science because I have
Right.
spent a lot of time in art with music and those pursuits, and I've spent a lot of time in science, and they aren't that different. I mean, different personality types might gravitate towards one or the other. But it's fundamentally not these two sides of a person. They are more similar
Right.
than not. And
And
people are going to argue about that with me, and bring it on. Uh, Happy to debate
well,
that.
I have found, like, as an artist, I have to crank out work all the time.
Yeah.
But what I find works for me, and this is backed up by a lot of other artists who work the same way, is that when you first get the project and you're designing everything and you're trying to come up with the overall idea of the thing, or if this is a personal piece you're working on or whatever, that beginning stage of like you just you do like word association,
Yeah.
you just free form think of whatever, and like anything goes into those initial stages. But then once you've come to a decision on what you're going to do, everything that follows is like a scientific approach to back up that initial idea or feeling. The very beginning isn't so scientific, but everything else, if you want that to have any sort of impact, you back it up by hard work and a pretty strict process.
Yeah.
And I've seen this. I mean, I watch the other artists work, and I've researched a lot of other artists, and that's pretty much how it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mix. It's a balance of both.
Well, so here's one key point on that. And somebody actually brought this up recently, I think, in a comment about how we were talking about categorizing things and giving them names and trying to create these symbols in your mind to attach a lot of information. And this person's observation, which I totally agree with, is that when you do that, you can create these inflexible systems where you're kind of almost by definition trying to create a simplistic model of the world. You might say, at the start of every art piece, the very first phase is brainstorming, or I don't know art terms, but you have some.
That'll work.
Okay, you have your brainstorming phase, and then you have this phase, and you have that phase. And I've done the same thing for. Recently, I've started doing this for coding, especially my side projects where I have some idea that I want to hash out, but I have very limited time. So how do I? What is my process for that? And the danger there is that you create something inflexible where you have your process and it doesn't accommodate a piece that's a little bit different, or you aren't. There's new information that doesn't fit into what you've already defined. And I think that's one of the absolutely key things in that way of thinking, is that you're trying to design a system. You can call it a mental model, or whatever you want. You're trying to design a system that captures all this information. You have symbols in your head, or even something you've written out that tries to communicate, here's all the important things that need to be handled early on in the project, and here's the things that need to happen next, and here's this part of the process. But the important thing is that it remains flexible. And this is a major problem, I think, with learning from someone else. If you have a teacher, or you're watching someone instruct, or reading a book, anything, pretty often they will communicate those things. They'll give you a bunch of names and say, we gave this example last week, like for music, there's different eras of music. There's a classical and romantic and baroque and blah, blah, blah. And it's very easy for you to take that as just this concrete, factual thing that just is immutable. And if you're trying to, how do I say this? To avoid that problem where you're ignoring parts of reality to fit your model, you have to always remain flexible and constantly adjust the categories that you have, or rethink them, or acknowledge that there's constantly exceptions. Bach was sort of classical and sort of baroque and whatever, and that's just part of the fuzziness of the system. But there's a coach, a Starcraft player that I've watched, and I think he has an amazing philosophy, which is rare in that world anyway. But the thing he keeps saying, and it's really not that catchy, but it's true, is that you should define and refine. And basically meaning create some definition, some name, some classification, give it a name, call it something, start thinking about it in concrete terms, and then constantly change that, constantly reevaluate, and try to fit in new information and make adjustments, and understand that, oh, this is how I'm going to play the game unless this happens, and then I have to make these exceptions and things like that. Anyway, that's my little mini rant.
I have a couple thoughts.
Yeah,
I'm going to try not to forget them anyway. One of the ways that I've heard from one of my favorite artists, to successfully analyze a piece of art, you take, say, you're one of your favorite artists, and you take another one of your favorite artists who did something very similar, and you compare the two pieces. And the reason why you take two is so you can immediately tell, when you compare things, the uniqueness of each one stands out. I've been doing this, and I used to just look at one piece of art and I would analyze it and try to figure out why they were special or what decisions they were making or whatever. And it never really, I don't know, made an impact on me until I brought in a second one and I'm comparing the two.
So the past couple weeks, I was uh, in Florida, away from home, and I did not have the ability to play Starcraft at all. But I've been on this pursuit. I am determined to make it into Grandmaster League, so I really did not want to waste the time. I was really worried that 2 weeks is a fairly long time when you're playing something that's that difficult at a high level. So I really did not want to have to come back and endure a week or 2 weeks of just trying to get it back. Like, all right, I'm going to take that opportunity to spend my time watching professionals, watch them play, and try to gather whatever pieces of information I can from that. And the thing is, that is not that easy to do. I mean, you think about people who watch football all the time, and they're not good football players. They just watch it, right? Like, you'd think that you can learn all this stuff from watching professionals, but it is not easy at all. And I think the main reason is that you see the end result when you watch a professional player. Or here's another way of thinking about it. You might play or find a piece of music, like let's say by Chopin, right? Chopin, incredible composer. I just next level, wonderful music. And you could learn to play that piece, but that does not make you a good composer. It doesn't bring you any closer to being a composer on the level of Chopin, because all you're doing is just seeing what he did and playing it, performing it. And I can watch a professional play a game of StarCraft and I can see what they did, and I could even write it all down and say they made this unit at this time and they had this supply at this time, and I can try to emulate that same game, but they made certain choices and did certain things because of things they saw in the game and decisions they made and their understanding. And I don't have that, and I can't just copy it, because
Right.
you're seeing the result of reasoning and understanding. You can't just copy the result. You need to find the underlying things. And I think that's the main reason why it's so difficult to do that. Like, if you want to be a composer like Chopin, you're going to have to somehow unravel what he did and try to understand, how did he sit down at a blank page and come up with this piece. There was all kinds of little decisions made along the way, and he has to have this really deep understanding of music and how it goes together. So that was something I'd been struggling with a lot. Just how do I make that effective? And there's a couple things that I have come up with, and I think that actually those 2 weeks of time were really valuable, and I maybe even better than if I had just been playing the game. One is that the thing you're looking for, at least for me, like watching a game like this, is to see when a pro player makes a decision that I wasn't expecting. And the point isn't that I need to learn, okay, well, they saw this and they did this. The thing you're looking for is the reason why. And this falls into the category of things that are hard to articulate, so we don't talk about it very much. But I think it's really critical. There's this feeling of, like, you see something, it doesn't quite make sense, and you really, really want to ignore it. It doesn't fit with your current understanding or your mental model, and so you just don't really want to pay attention to it. But you have to, because that is revealing some key piece that you are missing. For example, I was watching Cyril, who's one of the top players in the world, playing a game. And he sent, I know people don't know what I'm talking about, but you'll get it by context, I think. It's in the early game. He's scouting the opponent, and he sees something, and he sighs, and he goes, second chrono. And at the time, I'm like, that means nothing to me. That little casual comment just passed by. Like, I would ignore it, hardly even remember it. But I'm thinking, no, I don't understand why he said that. Why is he sad that there's a second chrono? What does that mean? What is he talking about? I have no idea. And the fact that I have no idea why he's sad about a second chrono means that I'm missing something that he has and I need to figure it out. And so I start digging into that and trying to understand what does that mean. And eventually I have to watch games and research and, like you said, compare with different people, try to understand what the commonalities are, and eventually find that, okay, if the opponent is spending their second chrono like they did in this game, that means that there's going to be early aggression and you have to respond in certain ways or else you're going to take a bunch of damage. And I finally understand that. And now when I play a game, I know exactly what I'm looking for. But the point was, the thing that I was missing was very fundamental. It was this simple understanding of the basic units and basic build orders, and I had to unravel it. It did not. Cheryl doesn't go, oh, they're spending a second chrono. That means this and this and this, and I'm going to respond by doing this and this. Like, you just see the result of the game. You have no idea what he's thinking, and it's hard to unravel that stuff. So, anyway, that's a long tangent, but the core idea that I want to get across in terms of this was my understanding of the wasting time thing. It wasn't so much the performance, which I think is what you're talking about, where I have this thing I want to do. How do I eliminate any moment of wondering and hesitation and so on? The way I was thinking about it was, if I'm taking in information, in this case, watching pros play the game, how do I find the pieces that actually matter and will help me get better at the game? Because it's pretty easy to think that I'm learning by just sitting there watching game after game, and that doesn't necessarily make me any better at all. I have to find those things. And what I have found is that it is almost always this little feeling of discomfort and desire to ignore something that's a little bit odd, that doesn't quite fit with my understanding. And that's a giant red flag of, this is important and this is something I have to go unravel. And if I can, then I can learn that piece of information, reevaluate or rethink my understanding of the game, and then I actually become better. It leads me to make different decisions in the game itself.
Okay, well, everything that you're talking about is exactly what I meant by this thing, purgatory.
Okay.
Is that you have to make a decision when information is coming at you, and you have to know what that decision is going to be. And that part of your brain that is deciding that is your mental model being compared to reality, what's happening. And you're building that model by analyzing the grandmasters, the best of the best, and you're trying to understand them in any way you can. So to the best of your ability, you're analyzing them to build that decision-making part of your brain.
Yeah.
Right? So that wondering, that's what I mean. All of this is the same thing. This is a really big topic. Studying the masters. Why do you do it? You're trying to eliminate wondering what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
And that's why you study the masters. And actually, because you bring up Chopin, I think that this story is about Chopin. It might be about a different composer. But apparently, I think the story goes that Chopin would play Beethoven every morning. And he said when he did that, he could feel the spirit of Beethoven in his fingertips as he played. The rest of the day, he could feel that spirit of Beethoven, probably not literally, but he could feel that in all of his music that he wrote after, and all of his compositions. And I could be getting the composers wrong in the story, but what he's talking about there, I think, is exactly what we are trying to do with studying masters. I study who I think are the top artists because I want to get in their head, because I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And you're trying to get in their head because you want to know what the right decision is. Just like you in a Starcraft game, you have to make that decision quick. As an artist, you have to know what the right decision is. And the right decision is what you want. But what do you want? Well, it's based on what you've studied and what you've seen and what you have enjoyed and liked in other people. You like how certain masters play that appeals to you. I like how certain artists are that appeals to me. And so the things I like about them, that's the right decision for me. Someone in the Discord chat was talking about how do you know, I'm gonna get this wrong, but how do you know what's right and wrong in a like playing a solo or improving? Like I don't know what is right for me. And I think that that is something that you have to build by studying the masters. And that, see, he's stuck on wondering what's right and what's wrong. That's the purgatory.
Yeah.
And so it's not always simple like, oh, I don't know what to do. It is like that inner thing that makes the decisions of what's right and wrong. It's that mental model, and you're trying to build that. I don't know if that made any sense, but
Well, I like your possibly wrong and made up story about Chopin playing Beethoven.
yeah.
Because so here's the other piece of that. I'm watching professional players and I'm trying to figure out how do I make this actually help me. And again, I think the default is that it doesn't. Most of the time, just watching. I mean, I could look at fantastic artists all day. That is almost certainly not going to make me the slightest bit better at art, right? Same for, I think, anything. It is osmosis is not a real thing. You don't just slowly absorb all this stuff and suddenly
I know because I've tried for years and it didn't work. And I finally got it to where it's working. But okay, go ahead.
So there were two major things for me in doing this. One was what I just said, looking for those moments where there's a decision that I didn't quite understand and trying to unravel why was their decision different. The other thing was, I was thinking about, I think I gave this example before about how with machine learning, the way you take a neural net or some machine learning system and teach it something or get it to become good at something is by having it run through the simulation a bajillion times, and it slowly converges on a correct solution. That's how a machine can play Atari games, or how it can do whatever, is that they run a simulation a bajillion times a second, and that keeps slowly evolving to where it gets better at it. We talked about Mario and how you can do that with playing a game like that. Anyway, I'm looking at these games and thinking they're pretty often a game will come down to a tiny moment or maybe a couple tiny moments where one player has to cast spells, control their army, set up, there's some big final fight, and it all comes down to how well you can handle this little scenario, and then that determines the winner of the game. And I'm thinking, how could I ever practice that? How could, like, that scenario might come up 1 in 1,000 games, and it determines whether you win or lose. So I can't play, if I played 10,000 games, I practice it 10 times. Like, the numbers don't add up. How could I ever get good at that? And then I started realizing that the way to practice and get good at those little moments is not to actually do it. It's to simulate it in your head. And if you can do that, then you could practice something 1,000 times in a day or a couple days by sitting there and simulating it. And that is not nearly as easy as it sounds. You have to be able to
sound easy.
Well, okay. Well, it's not. By simulate, I mean, I've started trying to think about how do you. So here's what I did. And I actually think this is fantastically helpful. When watching a pro player, I would watch them take an engagement, have this moment, pause the game, and then in my head attempt to visualize everything that they've done, all the way down to which keys they pressed, which finger, how they moved their mouse, how they did everything. And it's hard to do. It required me to figure out, like, there's a lot of stuff that you do and you can't actually visualize it. In fact, most things you do, you can't visualize. I know that my body kind of knows what to do in certain situations, but I can't actually picture it mentally. And if you're a musician, I think this is pretty apparent. Like, you might learn a song, but you can't actually sit there and think through the whole thing. But if I can do that, if I can actually get to where I can mentally think through exactly what I would do, then I can simulate those situations in my head, and I can sit there and watch a professional game and mentally emulate what that professional player is doing. So in a sense, I'm like shadowing them in my mind, practicing imitating them mentally, uh, as a way of like getting their execution, their decisions ingrained into my own mind. And it sounds kind of out there, but that has been a huge, to me, that was like one of the major keys for watching someone, observing a master, and then getting it to actually affect me and my own play, is this idea of being able to emulate them in my head.
I don't think it's out there at all. In fact, I think this was well known in the past and has been completely forgotten. Like Chopin playing Beethoven, possibly Chopin and Beethoven. Uh, all the old artists, the
Yeah.
French Academy, the classical artists, they all studied heavily the paintings of the great masters. They would go to the museums and they would set up their paints and copy brushstroke for brushstroke these paintings, and they would do sketches of the paintings. They would study all of these masters, and that's what the classical composers used to do.
Yeah.
Every artist that I really admire, all of them have a single artist that they grew up emulating. I can name them all. It's incredible. Everywhere you look, that's what's happening. Child prodigies, they're emulating someone. Always. There is always someone close by that they start off their magical skills with. Always.
Yeah.
They have a starting point in someone close to them. And children learn through mimicry.
Mm-hmm.
You don't give them a book when they're 3 years old, and yet they can talk because they're mimicking you. It's incredible what we can do. And yet as we get older, we get further and further away from that thing that we can all do. And
Yeah.
we forget that you can even do that. So what I do every morning now is trace over line by line one of my favorite artists, and that it slows me down and forces me to think about every single line that he makes, and I'm questioning why he does it, and I take notes and I just study like a single piece in the morning, and it's been absolutely incredible because I get the feel of what it's like
Yeah.
to make those lines and think like him. And of course, I don't know what he's actually thinking, but I'm trying to mimic him in my own work. And I'm not stealing his stuff. I'm not
Right.
like calling his things my own, but I'm trying to get into his head as to why he's making those decisions. Just like I think Chopin is trying to get into Beethoven's head and make those decisions. Um, and why you're trying to get into Grandmaster's head. I mean, mimicry to me is like, I don't know. It seems like something we just ignore as we're adults, but
Yeah.
this is how humans learn when they're born, is just instinctively mimicking. And I think we should pay more attention to it. So I don't think it's out there.
Well, it's out there to me because that's not a piece of advice that I ever got. You know,
Yeah, me neither.
there's this typically, if I'm trying to learn something, the thing that you're instinctively taught to do or you think to do is to try to find somebody explaining it. And that can be great for certainly for certain things. That's great. Like I can go watch a professional Starcraft player explain their understanding of the game. I can watch, there's plenty of physics and science things on YouTube. You can go learn about different concepts, but there is a problem in that people, this is one of the fundamental, I think, themes of this podcast, I think, is that we tend to explain things or talk about things that sound good and feel logical. And the things that are kind of odd and weird and difficult to articulate, we don't talk about those. Like the whole memory thing and how the secret to remembering things is to make them weird. And we don't ever talk about that because it's weird. But it's like the answer to memory. And that there's all kinds of tiny little instances of that when you watch someone explaining something, and that they're telling you what sounds logical, what feels good, what feels right, and they're not trying to be deceiving or anything. They just don't. That's just human nature. That's what we do. We present things, we tell them, and they're never able to perfectly communicate their real internal model of something. But if you watch someone do something, you watch an artist, or look at a piece of art, watch somebody play, if you attempt to get yourself inside their head and emulate stuff mentally, you start to discover these little things that are odd and difficult to explain, but they're there and they're important, and like, oh, they see this, they do that. This is their instinctive response. Specifically, Cyril, the Starcraft player, there's try to explain this without being boring, and because I know nobody plays StarCraft, but there's a situation where your opponent, if it's a Protoss, has this spell where it's basically like this little bomb, and it moves across the screen and then explodes. Any of your units underneath that bomb die, and it's devastating. And so it's very critical when you're playing against this type of unit and this type of play style to split and move your units around, so you're essentially dodging this bomb. And Cyril does this thing. He's super good at dodging this. And what he does is he, like, if the bomb is coming this way, he splits his army like this, and then he takes a piece of it and he moves past the bomb. It's a disruptor shot for anybody who does play StarCraft. I can't really explain it because you just have to kind of see it and go, oh, he has this little three-pronged movement pattern where he quickly moves his unit in the opposite direction of where it's coming from. And it's hard to articulate. No one would explain that. No one would say, well, the proper way to dodge a disruptor shot is to move in two places and then quickly dodge in front of a shot. Like, it doesn't make sense. But if you watch it and you sit there and like think, yes, this is the way to do it. I've started doing that in games and it works amazingly well. It's this tiny, difficult to articulate thing, but I learned that from watching him and just mentally trying to picture myself doing that. And it's really effective, but it's not something you find in an instructional video.
You remember the chess family?
Yeah. Judith Polgar. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just give the premise of that? Because you read it more recently than I did. But I have a theory go ahead. Explain that.
I can't remember the names. Judith Polgar, which I think I'm saying that right, I don't even know, is the super, super high level chess player, easily the best female chess player of all time, and has beaten number one chess players like way, way up there. And so the origin story was that her dad was a teacher, professor, somebody, I can't remember, but he basically had this theory that talent is a myth, which is something that we have settled on as our belief system. But he basically said if you put somebody in the right environment and you teach them if they think the right way and blah blah blah, then they can be as good as anyone. You know, it's not some genetic wiring of your brain that causes you to be good at chess or not good at chess. And he contacted I think it was a teacher, and said, let's get married and have children and do this experiment. I'm certain that it will work. And I guess eventually she's like, okay. And so they did. They raised 3 children, and they were all great at chess. And one of them was Judith Polgar, who became, the best female player of all time.
Well, it was the youngest one, right?
Yes.
The youngest one became the best. So the oldest one became very successful. I don't remember exactly. And then the second one was apparently even more successful than the first, I think. And then the youngest one becomes the best. And I was thinking about that, and my theory is that they started them right off the bat. They're playing chess stuff, and they're learning from the parents. The parents are, I'm sure, very good at chess. I don't remember their ranks or whatever. But the oldest one, the firstborn, is mimicking the parents, learning from the parents. Parents are teaching her and whatever. Second one is now learning from the parents and from the sibling. And then the third one is now learning from both siblings and the parents. And I've watched our nieces, and you have the youngest one and then slightly older. I think they were, I don't know, maybe 5 and 3 at the time, something. I should, anyway, the youngest one is saying something that none of the adults understand, and then the slightly older one translates for the child
Yeah.
to the adults, and then the adults say something, and then she translates it to the younger one, which I think is incredible. Uh, but I was thinking about the chess family and how we mimic people to learn things, and if the jump, like, we all prefer people that we relate to, right? Like, if you see commonalities, you prefer to be around those people and you learn faster that way because the jump is shorter in your brain. Like, you can more easily see how things line up. So I think my theory on the chess family is that the youngest one had the closest jump to make with the other. She had the other two siblings who are close in age to her and the parents. Uh, so she doesn't have to translate adult behavior into little
Mhm.
kid behavior. She can channel little kid behavior that's channeling older people behavior. I don't know. It was just, does that make sense?
So
It's like the jump is shorter.
here's my experience with that. So playing a game like Starcraft is skill based, and the way matchmaking works, and this is for any competitive game, for chess, you play chess online. You try to get the matchmaking system tries to match you with people of a similar skill level, and sometimes you might get matched up with someone who's way higher than you. Today, actually, I played the one of the top 70, or like the 70th ranked player in North and South America. So way up there. And I think I played really well. I was actually very happy with the way I played based on all those heuristics and ways of evaluating myself throughout the game. But I lost because the guy is amazing. He's extremely good. I think I even had an advantage at the beginning of the game, but it didn't matter because he just is really, really good at the game. And the problem with playing somebody who's so much higher level is that you, if you do something that's really good, you never know because you're going to lose anyway. It is incredibly unlikely that you will beat someone that is that much higher ranked than you. So you can sit there and maybe you have all these bad habits and things that you need to improve, and you improve some of them, and the result is the same. You lose over and over. Like, the gap is just too big for anything to ever matter. You're way too far away. So it becomes really difficult unless you have a really good system of evaluating yourself. Anything you try doesn't win. But if you're playing people that are of a similar level, ideally a little bit higher than you, okay, opposite problem. If you're playing somebody way lower, you could play terribly and still win because they suck, and then you just win. Right. So it doesn't. Your play could degrade and get worse and worse, and you're still going to win every game. Like, it's very difficult to recognize, oh, this was bad, this was good, whatever. But if you're playing somebody at your level or a little bit higher, if they're a little bit higher than you, there's this constant pressure to try and overcome something. You're having to push your boundaries a little bit, which we've been saying is really important. But if you do something that's unusually good, you may win. And that's great. That's a great reinforcement of what you've done. So I think you want to be exposing yourself to somebody who is better than you because it pushes you to try and play better than you have before. But if it's too big of a gap, it doesn't matter what you do, you just won't win. And I imagine that is the case for playing chess. In this chess family, if the youngest is constantly under pressure to try and beat the older sibling, but it's not such a massive gap that it never ever matters, then you wind up with just the right amount of pressure to try and cause them
Right.
to play just a little bit better and be rewarded if they do something really well.
And you're being rewarded for the right things.
Right.
Like
Right.
if you're doing your best, yeah, you win for that.
Right.
And that, yeah.
Right. It's really difficult to get better if you're playing someone a lot worse than you. It's difficult to get better if you're playing someone way better, but that's the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Somewhat better than you.
I'm gonna have to look into that, see if that lines up with.
Yeah.
But I don't. It makes sense to me, and I mean, for me, I've learned a lot from artists that are like not the masters, like artists that are similar to me,
Yeah.
a little bit better than me in some areas, and not as good as me in others. Like I learn a lot from them because the jump isn't so big.
Right.
Because you get someone who's really, really good at something, and they've been really, really good since they were a little kid. They don't remember, or they don't even know
Yeah.
what someone like me is struggling with because they haven't struggled with it in 50 years.
Hmm.
So even though they may be a really good teacher, they may not know the information that you actually need to hear. And someone your age or at your skill level uh, may have just solved the problem that you're looking to solve, and so they would know to be able to tell you that.
Right.
So I have 7 things on the list.
And we did 2.
This was number 1.
Okay. Well, we talked about
And we
number 3,
mentioned a
right?
little number 3, yeah.
All right. That's okay.
But
We'll save it for
this was
next
my
week.
favorite one. This is my favorite.
All right. Well, can we summarize what we just talked about for an hour?
We can try. Yeah.
Well,
So,
what was item 1 and 3, the ones that we talked about?
well, number 3 is forgetting what you've learned. Like it is absolutely vital that you remember what you've learned. Otherwise, you just wasted a whole lot of time
Yeah.
learning something. Like I have spent like years learning stuff that I've completely forgotten.
Yep. Same.
And if I just remembered it, I wouldn't have to spend another year learning these things again. So that's important. And I would like to get even more into that and memorizing things. And
Right.
that's a big topic. All right. Number 1 is purgatory, which is, it covers a lot of things, but it's, you want to know the right answer at all times. Like any grandmaster, anyone who's really, really good at what they do, they
Yeah.
don't seem to question what's right and wrong. They just seem to do the right thing every time. It looks like they just know what the right thing is because they probably do know what the right thing is most of the time. And that's where you want to get to. And there's a lot of different tactics or a lot of different things you can do to build that idea of what's right and what's wrong. Even with something as creative and something like music or with art, like there are ways of thinking that are more right to what you want out of that.
Here's how I would summarize that in my head. One of the basic fundamentals to improvement is that you don't want to make the same mistake twice, right?
Right.
You know, if you started a piece of art and you did the wrong thing, I don't know, drew a character with poor proportions or something like that, then like that's a mistake and you would go, I messed this up, so I need to fix that mistake. But hesitation, or purgatory as you said, you should think of that like it's a mistake. If you are trying to do something and you get stuck in that mode of I don't know what to do, then you should classify that as a mistake that you want to fix. But we usually don't. We just think of that as like, well, I don't know, I had to figure out what the right thing to do was, and then eventually I did, and then I did it. And
Right.
if you wound up concluding the wrong thing, then you would say, oh, I made a mistake there. For me, playing this game, if I sit there and think, I don't know what to do, should I do this? Should I do that? And it takes me 10 seconds, and then I do the right thing, that's a mistake. Because it took me 10 seconds, and that was a 10-second mistake where I'm hesitating, where I don't know what to do. So I have to classify that as an error, and I want to resolve that. So I think we tend to not think that way, but we should. We should see purgatory as an error. And anytime it comes up, even if it's tiny, you're trying to resolve that to where you
Right.
know what the right choice is there. Or maybe you have two choices and either one of them is a good choice, but either way, you identify that and think, next time I will not hesitate. I want to know, I want to have it in my mental model, in my memory of what the choices are in that situation.
I think, yeah, I think that's a good summary of it because, and I think it's really important to start identifying just that. Like,
Yeah.
it's it's hard to tell sometimes. Like, it's hard to know if you're wondering what to do or what the right answer is or whatever. Like, I used to do a piece, and if it turned out really bad, I would be really thankful that it's over. I'd be really excited for the next piece so I could prove myself, but I wouldn't really review
Yeah.
and figure out what actually went wrong. And I would just go to the next one and try harder, but I would slip right back into that same or similar
Right.
purgatory of, God, what am I
Right.
doing?
Or
Maybe a
maybe,
couple lessons were learned, but
yeah, or maybe
yeah.
you get lucky and the next piece happens to be something that you're more comfortable with or have a better understanding of. You still didn't resolve anything, right?
Right.
Like you, yeah.
Yeah.
Just,
But now, sorry, but now reviewing pieces with the very clear intent of removing
yeah.
that feeling and or that searching for the right answer and trying to come up with a roadmap to get rid of that feeling uh, has kind of changed everything for me. And that's what I would encourage.
All right. Well, we've been talking forever, so let's wrap it up. Save something for next week. Um,
Okay.
but
Remember the
thanks.
closer?
Yeah, yeah, kind of. Thanks everybody for listening. Email us at the OverAnalyzers podcast at gmail.com. Leave us a review. Hang out in our Discord. There's many ways to talk with us. But thanks. See you next week.